At 5:47 a.m., Luftwaffe pilot Hans Müller took his final photograph before turning home. The note in the mission log was routine. The morning sky over northern France was pale and cold, the light just beginning to stretch through the clouds. Below, his camera captured endless lines of what looked like American armor. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, their tracks cutting deep scars into the damp earth. Dust hung in the air like proof of movement. Hours later, when the film reached the German intelligence office near Metz, officers leaned over the prints with disbelief. Ein massiver Aufmarsch, one of them whispered. A massive build-up. The Americans, they concluded, were preparing another push toward the Siegfried Line. The photos showed entire armored battalions moving north. Radio intercepts confirmed it, transmissions buzzing with activity, columns on the march. By dusk, Müller's aircraft would be shot down over the Ardennes. His camera would be found intact. But what he'd photographed that morning wasn't an army. It was an illusion, one built out of air, fabric, and sound. That same morning, 15 miles west, in a muddy French field bordered by poplars, 82 men stood beside a line of deflated rubber. The air smelled of gasoline and wet canvas. A few of them, wearing paint-smeared fatigues, were arguing about shadows. Too sharp, one said, squinting through the haze. The sun hits the left side, make it look heavier. He wasn't a soldier by trade. He was a stage designer from New York. The man next to him, kneeling with a wrench, had once painted billboards for a traveling circus. Another carried a sound recorder instead of a rifle. Together, they formed the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit officially so secret that even their supply officers didn't know they existed. On paper, they were just logistics. In reality, they were building ghosts. They inflated the rubber shapes with foot pumps and compressors, the slow hiss of air filling the silence until the first Sherman tank began to rise from the ground. Within 20 minutes, a field of canvas and air looked ready for war. Metal paint added a dull gleam. Mud was smeared over the sides to look like battle grime. Someone even drew false serial numbers, careful not to duplicate any real unit. Nearby, 2 engineers worked inside a radio truck, threading reels of magnetic tape. Static crackled, followed by recorded chatter, clipped American voices, coded reports, bursts of laughter. Through hidden speakers, the air filled with the illusion of a busy command post. From above, it was perfect. From the ground, it was madness. A private named Ellis, barely 20, wrote in his journal that night, "We're an army of painters. We create the war we're supposed to fight. If we make a mistake, the Germans will send real tanks, and we'll vanish faster than the paint dries." He wasn't exaggerating. Their mission was to trick the enemy into attacking empty space, to draw artillery fire, to mislead reconnaissance, to pretend they were divisions that didn't exist. Each day began with sketches, ended with silence. They learned to place fake tracks leading to nowhere, to let engines idle behind tree lines just long enough for scouts to hear them. Even the smell of diesel was manufactured, a chemical blend burned in barrels to drift downwind toward enemy lines. One officer, watching the sunrise over their inflatable battlefield, said softly, "If they ever find out, we'll die as magicians, not soldiers." That was the paradox of the Ghost Army. Their success meant invisibility. Their only witnesses were the enemy, and the enemy could never know who they were. By noon, German reconnaissance planes circled overhead. The men froze, staring up at the drone of engines. The fake tanks gleamed convincingly in the morning light. A few of the artists grinned, others prayed. One whispered, "They're buying it." And they were. The pilots photographed everything, the shadows, the dust, the armor moving across the fields. In Berlin, analysts pinned those photos to wall maps. Arrows shifted. Orders changed. No shots were fired that day. Not yet. When evening fell, the rubber tanks deflated again, folding into heaps of canvas. The sound equipment went silent. The men gathered in the dark, exhausted, surrounded by the ghosts they'd built and dismantled. Ellis looked across the empty field where the army had stood and murmured, "All that air, and it's still heavier than the truth." Somewhere above, the same German pilot circled once more, believing he'd found proof of a massive invasion. He clicked the shutter for the last time. He never knew that the army he saw, the one that seemed ready to strike, had vanished before he even landed. In a world where bullets decided everything, 82 artists had chosen another weapon. They fought with illusion. And that morning, illusion had won. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The old RAF airfield no longer smelled of fuel and steel. It smelled of rubber, paint, and secrecy. August sunlight fell flat on the cracked runways, where men in U.S. uniforms unrolled long bundles of canvas across the ground. From a distance, it looked like a circus setting up. Up close, it was something stranger. Compressors roared alive. Hoses hissed. The fabric rose slowly, shaping itself into tanks, turrets, barrels, bolts that weren't bolts at all. Within minutes, a dozen Shermans stood gleaming like real armor. A corporal dabbed mud on the rubber hull with a brush. Another painted serial numbers that led nowhere. From 10 feet, it was a joke. From 1,000 feet, it was war. Inside a nearby hut, the sound engineers worked in darkness. Spools of wire looped across the floor. A reel-to-reel recorder clicked on, flooding the air with the drone of engines and bursts of shouted orders. "Filter the bass," one said. "Make it sound like it's coming through trees." Outside, the field vibrated faintly, as if hundreds of trucks were rumbling just over the hill. Sergeant Ellis stood in the doorway, watching the scene with a mix of pride and dread. He was 20, a billboard painter before the war. "We're making ghosts," he muttered. "And if one of them pops, we'll join them." He wasn't wrong. Their unit, 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, had no official name, no press releases, and no medals. Only orders: make the enemy believe. By afternoon, a full armored division filled the airfield, fake tanks, inflatable artillery, and rubber half-tracks positioned with mathematical precision. A truck dragged a chain through the dirt to create tracks. Another burned barrels of diesel to spread the right smell downwind. A colonel inspected their work, hands behind his back. "If Jerry buys this," he said, "he'll waste shells here, not on the real boys." Ellis grinned weakly. "And if he doesn't buy it?" The colonel didn't answer. At dusk, the painters worked under blackout lamps, brushing false shadows across the tank hulls. One sculptor from Boston argued about where the moonlight would fall. Another swore softly, correcting the curve of a turret that would never fire. When they finished, the line of rubber armor looked solemn and still, like real soldiers waiting for orders. In the sound hut, a new tape began. Clanging tools, voices laughing, a sergeant cursing about fuel shortages. It was theater, but with bullets for critics. Each man knew that if a German patrol stumbled upon them, the illusion would collapse, and they'd have nothing but air between them and the rifles. Ellis wrote in his notebook that night, "We inflated 12 tanks, 8 guns, and 1 rumor." The rumor was the heaviest. Near midnight, 2 French boys stopped their bicycles by the fence. They saw the silhouettes against the sky, tanks lined up, engines humming, and whispered, "Les Américains sont partout." The Americans are everywhere. Ellis almost laughed. "We're nowhere," he thought. And that's the point. When the lamps went dark, the field looked peaceful. A guard made his rounds, tapping each tank with his boot, listening to the hollow echo. The sound was thin, almost human. Before dawn, orders came through: pack up, move out. Tomorrow, they'd take their rubber army to a new sector closer to the front. The men didn't speak as they deflated the machines, the hiss of air sounding like sighs. One by one, the tanks sagged and folded into heaps of limp canvas. Ellis coiled the last hose and stared at the empty runway. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we fight with nothing." The captain passed by, clipboard in hand, and said quietly, "That's what makes it work." As the first light crept over the field, everything that had seemed real 12 hours ago was gone. Tanks, trucks, smoke, sound, erased without a trace. Only the footprints of men remained. The war would never remember their names. But tonight, the Germans would remember the ghosts. Dawn thinned over the hedgerows east of Metz, frost on the grass, and the kind of light that makes everything look honest. In that honesty, 200 men arranged a lie with surgeon's care. The grease-penciled map said, "Present 2nd Armored Division." Reality offered 5 trucks, a radio van, and a field that smelled of dew and gasoline. Silhouettes came first. Inflatable Shermans unrolled from sacks, canvas husks catching breath from compressors until turrets took shape. A crew chief painted a smoke ring at each muzzle. Another smeared mud with a brush where tracks should have flung it. Stakes pinned hulls so rope disappeared in the grass, like the fiction disappearing into the landscape. Sound followed. Theater speakers, big plywood boxes scuffed by half a continent, went along a hedge and a shallow arc cables ran to the van. A reel-to-reel turned and the air filled with layers. Engines at idle. The slow rumble of a convoy beyond the trees. The rattle of tools. A sergeant barking about fuel. The engineer shaved off highs, fattened the low throb. 15 miles, easy, he said, as if he were measuring fog. Two signalers strung decoy wire and rehearsed traffic for listening ears. Bridge delays, platoon rotations, a request for rations. The cadence matched the real division whose name they were borrowing, down to the pauses. If a German intercept operator lifted a handset, he would hear the right-wrong people. By sunrise, the ridge looked busy. Half-tracks squatted like teeth in shadow. A painted sign pointed to a headquarters that didn't exist. The unit patch on sleeves lied as well as the tanks did. A farmer and his wife stopped in their lane, caps in hand. Les Américains sont partout, the man whispered into the morning. Americans everywhere. The words rode the hedgerow like birds. The captain walked the line and counted hulls like breaths. Spacing, he said. Men heaved a rubber Sherman 3 feet to break a pattern only an analyst would notice. A billboard painter from Ohio scuffed a white star imperfect. A sculptor tapped a fake fender to hear a sound no real fender would make. No one said aloud that 200 men were impersonating 6,000. Near noon the first shells came. Careful, testing, the way artillery learns a room. Black puffs stitched the far slope, then stepped closer. Canvas rippled and remembered its shape. Hold, the captain said, though nobody had moved. The sound team faded the idle and pushed the grind of tracks as if an armored battalion were shifting under fire. The gunners took the bait. A faithful curtain of explosions marched along a sign that pointed nowhere. Fragments rattled across rubber skins and died in wet grass. A private flinched, laughed too loudly at himself, then stopped. The captain listened to the pattern like a doctor to breath. Miles away, the real second armored rolled through a different valley, radios quiet, tracks cutting a path no camera watched. A reconnaissance plane came low, silver belly bright, camera clicking like teeth. Ellis, chin in the ditch, wrote a line hard enough to tear paper. They are firing at our absence. When the barrage paused, they let silence stand a beat, then filled it. Wrenches clanging, a cough of an engine that didn't exist, a man swearing about bad gasoline. A lieutenant paced the motor pool with a clipboard that had never listed a real part and read numbers to nobody in particular. Dusk slid down the ridge. A blue-white flare rose from the woods. The Germans signaled to shift guns. The captain checked his watch. Darkness would save them if they started first. Packet. Valves turned. Air exhaled in long sighs. Turrets sank like shoulders. Hulls folded to skins. The carefully scuffed star wrinkled into a grin. Speakers came down. Cables coiled into loops that remembered distances. The tape clicked and stopped with a small end-of-song lurch. Men hoisted the weight of a day's deception into trucks that had hauled real things yesterday. By full dark, the ridge was a field again. Do reclaim the grass. The only proof of an army was the sweet tire smell of rubber and the wet tang of fresh paint on the captain's hands. Ellis stood where a tank had stood and felt nothing under his boots but earth. Far off, one last shell thumped into the wrong map square and did not correct itself. Sometime after midnight, the Germans edged forward to touch what they had shelled. They found stakes, faint track marks, and silence. A final angry volley went into mud. The army that had drawn their fire folded into sacks and drove away in 5 trucks. No graves, only a rumor and the hiss of air going home to canvas. And on the wind behind them, thin as a memory, the smell of new paint lingered, the only scent a vanished division can wear. The forest of the Ardennes was a dark ocean of trunks and fog. Engines growled somewhere beneath the mist, their echoes curling up the slopes like restless ghosts. It was October 3rd, 1944. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, had arrived to stage another illusion. Only this time, they were close enough to the front to smell cordite in the wind. They worked fast. Radios crackled with artificial chatter. 6th Armored repositioning east. Supply convoy delayed at the bridge. Command requests artillery grid confirmation. Every syllable had to sound routine, convincing, alive. Somewhere across the line, a German intercept officer listened, nodding grimly. So, the Americans were massing armor in the valley. He marked it on his map and reached for the phone. In the Real forest, there were no tanks, just rubber shells, canvas stretched over frames, and a handful of artists trying to act like soldiers. Bill Blake, one of the painters turned decoy designers, crouched beside a deflated half-track, brushing frost from its side before repainting the number it never had. He wrote in a letter that night, "We create deception so real that even we start to believe it. That's when it works, and that's when it terrifies me." As twilight bled through the trees, the sound engineers switched tapes. The roar of engines grew heavier, closer, overlapping like thunder. The forest answered with silence. Then, somewhere far to the east, a flash. Then another. The Germans had swallowed the bait. Artillery began before anyone had time to react. The first shell hit a ridge above them, scattering bark and snow. Another burst too close. Blake felt the concussion hammer his chest. "Down," someone shouted. "But where do you hide when your army is made of air?" The next explosion struck one of the inflatable tanks squarely. It folded in on itself, hissing out life in a single breath. The rubber flapped like a wounded bird, collapsing against a tree. Blake stared at it. His own creation, now deflating under fire, and couldn't move. A private beside him laughed hysterically, a high sound of shock and disbelief. "They're shelling balloons," he said. "They're shelling nothing." The captain crawled past, face streaked with mud. "They don't know that," he snapped. "Keep the radios alive." Radios? Their only weapon. Inside the truck, a sergeant twisted knobs with shaking hands. Static howled. Voices overlapped. One frequency fell dead. "Lost contact with HQ," someone muttered. Another voice, calmer, older, said, "Then make new contact." The sergeant keyed his mic. "This is Baker Control. 6th Armored still holding. Request counter-battery fire." It was theater, improvised and desperate. Outside, the illusion burned. Trees caught sparks from shrapnel. The valley filled with the reek of diesel and smoke bombs. Sound crews dragged speakers into new positions, replaying loops of armor clanking across bridges that didn't exist. Each echo lured the shells farther from the real American line. Blake felt a piece of shrapnel rip through his sleeve. He pressed his arm against his chest, but there was no blood, just the shock of survival. Around him, the rubber tanks trembled under the percussion, their shadows flickering on fog like the ghosts they were pretending to be. One of the engineers looked up from his equipment and whispered, "If they walk in, we're done." The captain didn't look back. "Then we make them think we've already gone." By midnight, the shelling slowed. The enemy believed their barrage had hit true. In the lull, the men crawled from the mud, inspecting the wreckage. If wreckage could describe piles of torn canvas and broken frames. Blake knelt beside a melted patch of rubber that still smoked faintly. His fingers came away black. Somewhere beyond the trees, the real 6th Armored Division moved into position, unmolested. The Ghost Army had done its job. But the cost, the psychological one, hung heavy. These were artists, designers, sound engineers. None of them had signed up to watch their own illusions die under artillery fire. When dawn arrived, the forest was pale with mist again. Sunlight filtered through, touching the broken tanks, making them glisten like sleeping beasts. From a distance, to an enemy eye, it still looked like an army. To those standing among the ruins, it looked like madness. Blake wrote another line in his notebook before they packed up. "We fooled them, but we also fooled ourselves. We believed we were invincible until the shells told us otherwise." As the trucks pulled away, engines low and cautious, the sound men played one last recording into the fog. A loop of engines moving north, voices confident, the illusion still alive. And somewhere, listening on the other side of the line, a German officer heard that faint, stubborn convoy and ordered more shells for the next day. They had created the image of an army. Now, they had to pretend to survive like one. Snow found every seam. December 1944, outside Liège, the night air cut like glass. Trucks idled under blackout tarps, breath of engines mingling with the breath of men. The front was moving the wrong way, west, and each hour brought fresh rumors. Lost crossroads, broken lines, tanks with crosses seen in villages that had learned the taste of war once already. In that retreating noise, a small convoy turned off the main road and hid among pollard willows. The 23rd had orders that didn't make sense until they did. Make a corps appear out of frost. They worked without looking up. Speakers came off racks. Wire paid out across crusted fields that rang under boots. The sound team built a city of noise. Diesels idling, clatter of tracks, the unequal cough of a cold start Sherman, a sergeant barking that the refuel point had moved. Each layer ran from a different speaker bank, so the column seemed to stretch along a mile of hedgerow. The frequencies were cut to fit weather. The low rumble traveled far under the snow fog. The high stayed near, like breath. Inflatables unfurled stiff with cold. Canvas cracked at the folds. Men warmed seams with their gloved palms before the compressors brought shape into the rubber hides. The first tank rose slow, creaking as frost let go. A corporal brushed ash across the hull to dull the shine. Another scuffed a white star imperfect. Less theater, more life. "Who's left behind us?" a lieutenant asked, squinting into blankness. "Us," the captain said. On the road, real American units slipped by, faces set, eyes refusing contact. One driver leaned out to see the line of armor forming where no battalion had been yesterday. He saluted the lie without meaning to and rolled on. When they were gone, the 23rd became the front. Panic traveled the fields like wind. Ellis wrote later, "You can hear fear in snow. It makes a softer sound where footprints won't last." He helped run a cable through a ditch that smelled of iron and cold mud, then followed the line to the sound truck where a technician with raw hands mixed the world into obedience. "Give me more distance on B-Bank," the tech murmured. The second array came alive. Somewhere in the fog, armor moved forward, unseen but audible, like faith. Far off, a German flare lifted, whitening the sky. Silence answered. Then, in the whiteness, the first probing burst from an MG-42 stitched the hedgerow and found only rubber. A hiss, a sag, a shape bent inward like a man taking a punch. The captain didn't flinch. "Hold the engines," he said. "Nobody runs from sound." A staff officer from division arrived in a jeep, snow stacked on his shoulders like new rank. He climbed out, listened to the manufactured column grind past him in air, and said, "If they figure this, they'll ride right over you." "If they don't," the captain answered, "they'll shoot at ghosts while your people sleep." The officer looked at the white field, at men taping seams on pretend armor, at kids laying fake tire tracks with a chain dragged from a truck bed. "What if they do figure it? Then we die first," the captain said softly, and signed the receipt for a thing no quartermaster owned. Toward midnight, a patrol approached on the farm lane, dark coats, snow muffling their steps. The speakers vibrated the hedges with idling tanks. Shadows of barrels leaned through fog. The Germans halted. Someone whispered. Two men knelt to listen. A handlight licked across a turret's curve and came away persuaded by paint and silence. Breath hung in the air between the two lines like laundry no one would claim. Then the patrol eased back, a careful animal deciding the larger animal should be left alone. The soundmen only then allowed themselves to breathe. "Luck," someone said. "Craft," the engineer corrected, twisting the EQ another quarter turn until the manufactured winter felt complete. By dawn, frost had skinned the decoys in glass. From the ridge, it looked like a regiment had dug in. Tents, trucks, armor, all of it just real enough to force caution. Artillery began to search, not with fury but with curiosity. Shells walked the outskirts, nibbling. The men lay still among canvas bones and counted the rhythm. No barrage came. The deception had bought the night. Orders arrived on onion skin. Hold presence until 1300. Realignment in progress. Which meant the Real Army was leaving. Which meant the 23rd would be alone soon with its chorus of machines and its handful of rifles that wouldn't matter if tanks came. They rotated tapes to suggest relief units. New voices crackled. A fresh captain griping about rations. A mechanic cursing a bad starter. A radio check from a call sign borrowed from a division 50 miles away. The snow swallowed the lies and returned them honest to the tree lean. Ellis crawled to the edge of a ditch to watch the road. He could see nothing beyond a gray that ate distance, could only hear the bodies of engines they had made. He wrote a line he had to scratch out because his hands shook. We have built a wall out of air. At 12:45, the last real convoy passed behind them, thin, tired, eyes forward. After that, the road stayed empty. The sound fell to a breathing idle. The world waited. A new shape ghosted the far hedgerow, lower, heavier, wrong in every way the 23rd knew by heart. Not a patrol, something with tracks. The snow absorbed its approach and returned only the certainty of weight. When the real army had gone, the fog kept its color and the speakers kept their song, and the 23rd understood what the order had really meant. They had made an army appear. Now they would find out if a phantom could stand its ground. February 1945. The Rhine lay under a gray sky that pressed low, heavy with rain and exhaust. The town was a skeleton, brick ribs, twisted rebar, windows black with soot. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops rolled in at dawn, tires hissing on puddles filmed with oil. The air smelled of wet iron and canvas. Their mission was simple and impossible. Make an entire armored division appear on this side of the river, so the real one could cross 20 miles south. They began inside a bombed-out rail yard. The painters set up first. Stencils clattered, paint tins opened with metallic pops. A billboard artist from Chicago crouched by a jeep, brushing away the old emblem before painting the cross triangles of a regiment that didn't exist. Beside him, a sculptor traced false weld lines across the side of a rubber tank. When the rain blurred his work, he used soot instead of paint. It looked more authentic. We change armies like shirts, someone muttered, tugging a patch off his sleeve. Another soldier laughed. Sure, we just die in someone else's uniform. The sound men climbed what was left of a warehouse roof, hauling up speakers big as barrels. Below them, engineers stretched cables through puddles, marking safe paths with chalk arrows. In the radio truck, Sergeant Quinn tested loops. Idling engines, shouted orders, the clatter of treads over steel plates. Each sound had a purpose. Played together, they built a world. He adjusted the equalizer until the city itself seemed to breathe, metallic, rhythmic, alive. Make it sound busy, the captain said. A busy enemy is a real one. By noon the fog lifted enough for the first reconnaissance plane to arrive. Its silver belly flashed through the clouds. Men froze where they stood, watching it circle, cameras glinting. Then came the distant whine of bombs falling. 3 explosions ripped through the far end of the yard, tearing apart nothing but empty rails and air. When the dust cleared, Blake, the unit's best painter, was laughing. They bombed the sound of us, he said. Rain returned in the afternoon, steady and cold. The deception deepened with it. Men scattered fake fuel drums, stretched camouflage nets, and painted shadows where none existed. A corporal dragged a chain across the road to carve false tire tracks. Each detail mattered. Even lies needed consistency. We're building evidence, said Ellis, scribbling notes in his book. If God ever audits this war, he wrote, we'll owe him for creativity. At dusk, they added human noise. Mess halls, arguments, the faint rhythm of a jazz record skipping on purpose. The sounds echoed down empty streets and made the ruins seem lived in. The captain walked the perimeter, counting his ghosts. Tonight we hold, he told them. By morning, they'll think we outnumber them 10-1. Around midnight, the Luftwaffe returned. A single fighter dived low, guns flashing. Bullets tore through canvas tanks, deflating them in slow sighs. The men didn't run. They lay flat in the mud as the plane looped once more, searching for confirmation. From above, the wreckage looked like hit targets. The deception was complete. When quiet came, it felt heavier than the air. Blake lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, watching smoke drift through the broken roof. You think they'll ever know what this cost? He asked. No one answered. Outside, the rain hissed on deflated armor. Before dawn, word arrived. Enemy bombers had struck an empty valley, one that should have been filled with American armor. Their illusion had worked again. The men didn't cheer. They just exhaled, the sound lost in the rain. Somebody lived, Quinn whispered, rewinding the tape for the next operation. By sunrise, the rail yard looked abandoned again. Mud filled the fake tracks, covering every lie they'd built. On a wall, the chalk arrow Ellis had drawn still pointed east. He left it there. Let the Germans follow it to nowhere. Later, a captured pilot would insist he'd seen hundreds of tanks near the Rhine. His report would be filed, stamped, and believed. The real division would cross the river untouched, and the 23rd would pack up their paints, their speakers, their empty drums, leaving only ghosts behind. They had fought a war made of echoes and brushstrokes. And sometimes, that was enough to save a world built on steel. Programma, ChatGPT Skazilla. March 1945. The Rhine was a strip of gray steel under fog so thick it swallowed sound. Near Wesel, a convoy without headlights rolled to a stop beside the river. 200 men climbed out, their boots sinking in wet reeds. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, preparing for their final deception. By dawn, they needed to convince the Germans that 10,000 Americans were building a bridge right here. In truth, the real crossing would happen 20 miles south. They worked in silence. Painters and engineers hammered stakes into the frozen soil, stretching string in neat grids to mark streets of a city that didn't exist. Inflatable tanks rose slowly from canvas bundles, taking shape as air hissed through rubber veins. Their dull gray skin shone like wet armor in the mist. A sculptor rubbed graphite across the barrels to mimic steel. Beside him, a corporal poured a trail of diesel into the mud so the camp would smell alive. "We're ghosts with body odor," he muttered, and someone laughed softly, then stopped. The sound crews moved next. They laid thick cables through puddles, connecting heavy speakers hidden beneath nets. In the radio truck, Sergeant Quinn tested the reels labeled engines: river crossing, pontoon, construction, mess hall dawn. He started playback, and the dead valley filled with motion. Coughing motors shouted orders, metal chains biting against wood. Every noise was measured, mixed to echo exactly like an army at work. "Make it sound routine," the captain said. "Nothing fools like boredom." Across the Rhine, German observers listened. They heard activity, voices, vehicles. Through binoculars, they saw tents, smoke, supply trucks. In a nearby bunker, an officer tapped his map. "The Americans are crossing here," he said. And with that, the trap closed. Germans redirected troops north, leaving the real crossing site unguarded. Before sunrise, the first Luftwaffe plane broke through the clouds. The pilot swooped low, photographing rows of tanks and pontoon bridges that didn't exist. He radioed headquarters, a full division massing near Wesel. Minutes later, bombs began to fall. Explosions tore through the fog, shredding rubber tanks, flipping fake jeeps. But the sound crew didn't flinch. They raised the volume, layering chaos on chaos, making it sound like the Americans were still standing strong. Ellis, crouched behind a half-deflated tank, wrote in his notebook, "We fight with breath, not bullets. And the air is winning." When a shell landed close, he laughed through the dirt. "They're killing our shadows," he said, and calling it victory. By 4:30, enemy artillery shifted to full barrage. The Ghost Army's job was working too well. A message came from headquarters: "Keep the illusion alive until H-hour." The men followed orders as if their lives were made of smoke. They replaced every fallen decoy, repainted every mark, replayed every sound. To the enemy, the base seemed indestructible. A Luftwaffe pilot captured later would tell his interrogator, "We thought you'd lost your minds, building a camp under our noses." But it was genius. He never knew that the camp was gone before sunrise. At 5:10, the last phase began. South of Wesel, the true Allied forces launched their real crossing. Boats slipped through the fog, while German artillery hammered only the empty north bank. Every minute the deception held meant fewer dead on the real front. "We're buying them time," Quinn whispered, watching the clock. With nothing but air. When the message arrived, mission complete. "Withdraw immediately." The captain folded it without emotion. "All right," he said. "Turn it off." The compressors sighed. Tanks collapsed. The river swallowed its noise. Within an hour, the great base disappeared, leaving only puddles and broken canvas. At dawn, the men watched the far horizon burn with the light of the real battle. No cheers, no music, just quiet pride. Blake looked toward the river and said, "We just won a war that never happened." As the trucks pulled away, the fog thinned, revealing nothing. No tents, no engines, no trace of an army that had never been. But across the Rhine, The real soldiers were alive because of them. They had fought without firing a shot. And in that silence, they had changed the course of the war. May 1945. Paris was a celebration painted in light. Flags hung from balconies, champagne foamed in fountains, and the sound of laughter rolled through streets still cracked by war. The city exhaled for the first time in 5 years. But in a small, windowless room inside the Allied headquarters, there was no music. Only the steady hum of fluorescent lamps and the shuffle of papers that would bury one of the strangest armies the world had never known. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops sat around a long wooden table. Their uniforms were dusty, their insignia half-faded. Some looked like engineers, others like artists who had lost their brushes somewhere between Metz and the Rhine. At the head of the table stood an officer from Army Intelligence holding a folder stamped confidential, 50 years. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Gentlemen," he said, "your work has saved countless lives, but it will remain classified. You will speak of none of it, ever. No applause, no medals, just a paper to sign." Private Ellis, who had spent the war painting serial numbers on inflatable tanks, stared at the document in front of him. "No recognition?" he asked quietly. The officer didn't look up. "Your recognition," he said, "is victory." A pause, thin as the air in the room. The world doesn't need to know how close it came to losing. Across the table, sound engineer Quinn leaned back in his chair, a faint grin on his face. "So," he murmured, "we're ghosts again." No one laughed. Blake, the painter who once made rubber armor look like steel, reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny figurine, an inch-high model of a tank, hand-carved from scrap wood. He placed it in the center of the table. "We painted victory," he said, "but it'll never hang in a museum." The officer looked away, uncomfortable. Outside, through the thick concrete walls, they could faintly hear the celebration, the roar of crowds, the bells of Notre Dame, the horns of jeeps parading down the Champs-Élysées. The sound reached them like music from another world. Ellis opened his notebook and wrote one last line. "Sometimes real heroism is disappearing when everyone's watching." When the papers were signed, the men filed out quietly, leaving the little tank behind. A clerk would later sweep it into a drawer, not realizing it was the only monument they would ever have. In the hallway, Quinn stopped and turned to Blake. "What do we do now?" "Go home," Blake said. "Pretend we were never here. And if someone asks, tell them we fixed radios." The next morning, their unit ceased to exist. The trucks that once carried decoys and sound reels were reassigned, their storage crates relabeled for maintenance equipment. The files were sealed, the photos burned. To the public, there had never been an army of artists and illusionists who fought with paint, sound, and air. Yet, in small corners of Europe, the echoes remained. French villagers near Metz still spoke of the Americans who vanished overnight. A German officer, interrogated months later, confessed, "We were sure the Americans had 10 divisions on the Rhine. They fooled us completely." His interrogator only smiled. The report was filed, unread, in the same folder that bore the name 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Years later, when the veterans of other divisions gathered for parades, these men stayed home. Some returned to their art studios, painting quiet landscapes where the fog always hid something just beyond the frame. Others worked in radio or design, carrying their secret in the way they shaped sound and color. When they spoke about the war, they used different words. "We built things. We made noise. We fooled the darkness for a while." The world moved on. Medals were pinned, history books printed, monuments raised. None bore their names. But every time an historian looked at maps of that final push across the Rhine and wondered why the German counterattack never came, their invisible fingerprints were there, in the silence between battles, in the empty fields that never turned red. In 1950, Blake received a letter from an old comrade. Inside was a single line. If ghosts could sign paintings, the world would be full of masterpieces. He never replied. By the time the file was finally marked inactive, even the clerks had forgotten what it meant. The ghost army dissolved into legend, unwritten, unspoken, unseen. And outside that sealed room in Paris, the bells kept ringing. The world was celebrating its heroes. The real ones had already disappeared. 1996. In the quiet basement of the Pentagon, a metal door swung open for the first time in half a century. Inside, Dust floated like ghosts in the fluorescent light. Boxes lined the walls, each marked with the same faded words: 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, Restricted. A young archivist unsealed one and froze. Inside lay photographs of rubber tanks gleaming under French sun, spools of magnetic tape labeled engines, night convoy, bridge assembly, riverbank, and stacks of sketches that looked more like stage designs than battle plans. The war, it seemed, had left behind a secret playbill. A journalist from the Washington Post stood nearby, her pencil hovering. "What was this?" she asked. The archivist shrugged. "A deception unit, apparently. Artists, sound engineers, radio men. They built whole armies out of air." Days later, the story broke. The Ghost Army revealed, the soldiers who fooled Hitler. Across America, headlines called it the strangest weapon of World War II. Veterans' families wrote letters to the editor, asking if their fathers had really fought with paintbrushes and amplifiers. For the first time, the world wanted to know. One of those veterans, Joseph Leach, was 74 when they found him. He lived in a small house in Vermont, surrounded by canvases of rivers and skies that seemed to hum with unseen movement. When the reporter arrived, Leach opened the door and smiled like someone expecting an old friend. On the table sat a small rubber patch, the corner of an inflatable tank, still bearing a bullet hole. He spoke slowly, his voice rough but steady. "We didn't shoot," he said. "We performed. But every time the enemy fired at our decoys, real soldiers lived to see another sunrise." He paused, studying the piece of rubber as if it might answer him. "Funny thing," he added. "We pretended to be an army until we became one." The reporter asked, "How did you stand it, knowing you could die for something that wasn't even real?" Leach looked at her for a long time. "Because sometimes," he said, "a lie is the only way to protect the truth." When the documentary aired that fall, grainy footage flickered across the screen. Men inflating tanks, painting false shadows, playing recorded gunfire into the night. Over it all ran Leach's voice, low and certain. "We fought with illusions. And the illusion held." In classrooms, students watched in disbelief. Veterans from other divisions sent letters of gratitude. One simply wrote, "You saved us, and we never knew your names." For many of the Ghost Army's surviving members, it was the first recognition they had ever received. There were no parades, no medals pinned to chests, just a quiet validation, 50 years late. At a small ceremony in Delaware, a colonel handed Leach a plaque. It was modest, almost plain, engraved with words that made him laugh softly. In honor of those who made the enemy see what wasn't there. He touched the metal and whispered, "That's all we ever wanted." Afterward, he walked outside and stood beneath the evening sky. The air smelled like rain, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, soft, hollow, like the echo of a long-forgotten engine. He thought of his friends: Blake the painter, Quinn the sound man, Ellis with his endless jokes. Most were gone now, their stories sealed longer than their lives. He imagined them laughing again, standing in the fog with their phantom tanks, proud and invisible. "We were magicians," he murmured. And for one brief moment, the trick saved the world. The journalist later wrote that when Leach died a few years after the interview, the plaque was found hanging in his studio beside a single line painted on canvas. Courage isn't always seen. It's sometimes heard or imagined. The declassified archives became an exhibit, then a museum. Visitors stared at the rubber armor, the reels of sound, the photos of men smiling beside empty fields. Children asked, "Did they really fight like this?" The guide would nod. "Yes," he'd say, "and they won." Now, every time historians speak of the crossing of the Rhine, of the battles that ended the war, they mention the invisible division that never fired a shot, yet changed the tide. Their legacy is not in monuments or medals, but in every deception that spares a life, in every story that reminds us truth sometimes wears a disguise. The Ghost Army vanished long ago, but their echo remains, in the hum of an amplifier, in the whisper of wind through empty fields. They taught the world one final lesson: that courage can hide behind canvas, and that even shadows can save the living.